Perhaps the most frightening crimes are those involving completely unmotivated and inexplicable brutality, especially when children are affected. Judging by these parameters, today's story is one of the most heinous and cruel cases in global criminal history. Louisa Kokomor was born near Western Area, South Africa. Fate had always intertwined her life with violent people. In 1984, when she was 10 years old, her father died. The child had a close relationship with him. Despite working a lot, he always had time for his daughter. Soon after her father's death, Louisa's mother found a new man, but the stepfather turned out to be a bad person. He constantly humiliated the entire family, both morally and physically. His years of abuse were not in vain, as he made Louisa feel inferior. He did everything he could to make those around him feel worthless. As she grew up, Louisa could no longer endure this treatment and sought a way to distance herself from her family. So she hastily married the first man she met. His name was Freddie. He was 4 years older than her, and, to her dismay, no better than her stepfather. Her husband plunged her into an atmosphere of terror and constant fear. Fortunately, the young woman was lucky, and with the support of her mother, Louisa was able to free herself from the oppression of this relationship. After separating from Freddie, Louisa met a mechanic named Christo van der Merwe. He was quiet, hardworking, and caring, and seemed to suit her much better. They began dating and soon married. The newlyweds continued to live in the same area of South Africa. The couple first had a little boy they named Johan. 2 years later, on August 9, 2013, Poppy van der Merwe was born. The girl was astonishingly beautiful, with blonde hair and large blue eyes. Everyone who knew her emphasized the child's beauty, called her a doll, and admired Poppy. Unfortunately for Louisa, her new marriage was also doomed to fail. After the children were born, her husband changed dramatically before her eyes and became violent. Soon, abuse began. The young mother realized that this had to end, as it wouldn't get better. In 2014, just a year after her daughter's birth, she filed for divorce. According to the woman's confession, Christo beat her, just like her previous partner, and shortly before the divorce, he threatened to kill her. He began to behave so inappropriately that the mother of two was forced to obtain a restraining order against him. After the divorce, he had the right to 3 visits a month, during which he could interact with the children, but only under the supervision of a social worker. Additionally, he was allowed to call his children once a week. Most of these conversations were subsequently recorded. Christo adhered to all regulations and seemed to be a responsible person. Louisa, however, claimed he was a real monster. Soon, the young mother decided to move with her 2 children, and she found herself 500 kilometers away in the small settlement of Orania. In fact, it was a very small settlement with just over 1,000 inhabitants. The population consisted exclusively of white people, and the settlement was one of the safest in the region. The descendants of Dutch, German, and French settlers lived there. The protagonist of our story believed she could finally build a peaceful life for herself and her children. The small family was welcomed by the Orania community. The locals and members of the Dutch Reformed Church took them in and helped the family settle. Thanks to their assistance, the young mother found an apartment and a job in a local supermarket. Additionally, community members helped finalize the divorce proceedings Louisa was undergoing. The woman also wanted to bring her daughter from a previous marriage, Marisha, away from her tyrannical father. The girl wanted to stay with her stepmother and, in return, take on much of the housework and help care for the younger children. With the help of community members, the young mother managed to take in the then 14-year-old student. She helped care for the children and also handled some of the daily household tasks to support Louisa. The teenager was given responsibility for cooking and cleaning. She integrated so seamlessly into this small family that the children sometimes called her Mom. Marisha was naturally calmer than Louisa, which enabled her to manage the upbringing of small children better than a mother could. All this, of course, happened against the backdrop of Luisa's heavy workload, which consumed all her time and energy. In 2015, a man named Cobus Kokomor moved to Orania. He, too, was helped by community members and was offered a job at the local supermarket, where he met the mother of 2 children who had been living there for about a year. Like the heroine of our story, he had a series of failed marriages and relationships behind him. With each of his ex-wives, he had a child. In fact, he had been divorced twice. For his first child, he paid monthly child support. The man had little or no contact with his children and showed no interest in them. He had a very bad relationship with all his ex-wives. They called him a cruel man who knew no compassion. Unfortunately, Luisa didn't know this when she first met him. However, he seemed nice and friendly, as he had been more than once before, and so she let him into her life. She and Cobus entered into a romantic relationship quite quickly. A few months after they met, Luisa became engaged to him. Afterwards, the couple moved in together, and on November 14th of that year, 2015, they married. The day after the wedding, Cobus suddenly threw Marisha out of the house and sent her by bus to her father's home, so her favorite nanny and sister could no longer care for the children. This change in family life was very traumatic for the children. Johan and Poppy were very attached to Marisha, who was now replaced by a new man who paid them little attention. Because of this sudden change, the children became very moody. They found it hard to cope with the separation from their sister. To the great disappointment of the children, Cobus soon turned out to be the exact opposite of what they had expected. Marisha's care gave the children a sense of being needed and loved. She spent a lot of time with them and became a close person. The stepfather, on the other hand, was very irritable and constantly snapped at the children whenever they cried. During this time, both children were enrolled in a kindergarten as the adults were working and could no longer care for their daughter and son at home. The caregiver repeatedly saw the boy run away and hide in the bathroom when his mother and stepfather came to pick him up from kindergarten. The children did not want to go home. This was a clear sign. The kindergarten staff described Cobus as a very irritable and unpleasant man who seemed cold toward the children. On several occasions, the kindergarten staff noticed that the child behaved inappropriately when the parents brought him in. It was as if he was under the influence of medication. His reactions were slow. For this reason, it was suspected that the boy had been given sedatives. Johan was a very active boy. His parents had probably drugged him to manage and control him better. However, this was only a suspicion that could not be confirmed. When the caregivers asked the couple about this, they just laughed. No further such states were observed in the child later on. However, new symptoms of abuse appeared, which initially were not taken seriously. The caregivers noticed that the boy was often dressed in weather-inappropriate clothing, specifically the long-sleeve jackets and clothes in which the child was often brought to kindergarten, even in hot weather. Later, it was learned that this was done intentionally to hide the bruises on his body. When they tried to undress Johan, he became aggressive and prevented the caregivers from doing so he wore a jacket all day. According to the boy, his parents became very angry if he took off his thick clothing. Obviously, the parents intimidated the boy to prevent the revelation of domestic abuse to the care staff. After Luisa and Cobus began to question their behavior in the family, they simply stopped bringing Johan to kindergarten, while Poppy continued to attend regularly. According to law enforcement authorities, it was decided to stop bringing the younger girl to kindergarten because she was being asked questions and could not explain what was happening at home. Despite her obvious communication difficulties, the child tried to reveal the horrors of domestic violence. Little Poppy repeatedly told caregivers various horror stories and tried to show the bruises on her body, but the adults simply did not understand her. Over time, however, the caregivers noticed that the bruises on the child's body appeared in various strange places. They could appear on the earlobes or other atypical parts of the body. New bruises appeared faster than old injuries healed. Louisa and Cobus were repeatedly questioned about this. Each time, the couple invented new stories about the children's activities. According to the mother and stepfather, both Johann and Poppy were restless, ran and jumped a lot, so all the girls' injuries supposedly resulted from playing or carelessness. Since domestic violence could not be proven, the caregivers had to believe these stories. Moreover, the mother often claimed that the girl's older brother behaved aggressively toward her. Louisa pointed to Johann's behavior when she tried to explain why he no longer attended kindergarten. According to the mother, she was afraid that her son might traumatize one of the children, and therefore wanted to bring him back to kindergarten only when he was older and his stubbornness could be managed. The whole situation seemed strange to them, as the caregivers had never noticed that the boy behaved dangerously and aggressively in the presence of other children. On the contrary, he was intimidated and did not make contact. Despite the lengthy excuses, there were other people who suspected domestic violence in the family. A man who lived in the couple's neighborhood noticed that the adults were clearly violent toward the small children. He regularly heard arguments and saw the parents scolding and shouting at their daughter and son. Apparently, this behavior was triggered by the slightest misbehavior. The neighbor did not witness physical beatings firsthand, but he was sure they not only punished their children verbally, but also physically. One of the most unpleasant incidents, as the neighbor later recounted, involved Poppy. According to him, on one of the usual days, the stepfather began shouting loudly at the child, probably because the girl had wet the bed. Minutes after the scolding, the child began to scream loudly, and it was clear that she was not just crying out of resentment, but seemed to be beaten. The next day, the neighbor saw the little girl with a cast on her leg. The man also noticed the parents' indifference when they brought their daughter home from the hospital with a new cast. Her mother and stepfather didn't even help her out of the pickup truck. They drove their daughter around in the back seat of the truck like some kind of animal. The little girl not only struggled to get out of the truck, but also carried her backpack, which seemed quite heavy. Instead of supporting and helping her, her stepfather just hurried her along. The neighbor noticed that Poppy would wake up at night and cry. In his opinion, the child had nightmares, but instead of comforting her, the parents, whenever they reacted to her tears, would shout and swear at her, forcing her to be quiet. Nevertheless, she had such episodes almost every night, and the girl would cry quietly for about half an hour so that no one would hear her. But through the thin walls, the neighbor could hear the sobbing. Eventually, she would calm down on her own and fall back asleep. After the incident with the broken leg, and once the girl had recovered, there was another frightening case of aggression. A neighbor heard another argument begin in the family, followed by a dull thud. The girl again cried heavily and became hysterical. The neighbor saw her the next day as she walked around with a large hematoma on her head. Moreover, her right arm didn't seem to function properly. Poppy kept pressing it against her chest. At this point, the man couldn't take it anymore and went to her stepfather. He asked what was happening to the child, why the girl was constantly crying, and why she barely had time to heal her severe injuries. Cobus just grinned and became angry. He gave no answer and simply walked away. Instead, the children's mother spoke up. According to Louisa, the latest injuries were caused by a fall while playing on the stairs. She claimed the girl was very careless and constantly got into such incidents. It was just an accident, but the neighbor didn't believe her. What most outraged the neighbor was an incident in the winter when Cobus was working in the garden. It was quite cold, and the children were sitting on the porch. Suddenly, the man shouted at them and accused them of doing something wrong. The neighbor found this strange. He hadn't noticed the siblings doing anything bad. They were just sitting quietly. Then he undressed the children and doused them with cold water. The perverse man made them repeat some kind of apology that the neighbor couldn't understand. They did this while standing in the cold until they dried off, with the children crying and shivering violently. At the very least, they could have gotten sick. When the neighbor saw the abuse with his own eyes, he couldn't bear it anymore and went to social services. The staff of the organization should have investigated, written a report for the police, and then, of course, filed a request with law enforcement. However, there were no repercussions. The Social Protection Service simply ignored the incidents and the neighbor's statements. The man had to contact the organization several times until they finally took notice of the blatant brutality of the stepfather. The town was so small that it didn't even have a proper police station, court, or other important institutions. The nearest larger police station was at least 40 kilometers away, and the neighbor had no way to get there himself. But he didn't give up and kept contacting various organizations in his town to help the children. Fortunately, the cruelty did not go unnoticed, at least not by child protection officers. The children had a chance to end this nightmare. In August 2016, a meeting with Luisa and Cobus took place. The mother and stepfather were required to attend weekly checkups with a pediatrician, which both children had to attend. Additionally, the parents were obliged to attend special counseling sessions with a psychologist who dealt with family problems. The couple adhered to these rules for a while, but as it turned out, it was only for accountability. They went to counseling a few times in the first month and took the children to medical appointments only twice. It seemed they were on the path to improvement, but during this time, the neighbor reported the worst cases of domestic violence. When he again approached social services about this, he was once again brushed off with the excuse that they were already working with the family and had everything under control. But for some reason, that wasn't working, and the neighbor, for his part, could do nothing more. The man's words were quickly confirmed during the next medical examination. Multiple bruises were found on the body of 3-year-old Poppy. The girl was examined to determine their origin. Given her age, however, she was still very hard to understand. Her explanation only revealed that she was in great pain. In fact, the doctor conducting such examinations should have immediately documented any bruises. But in this case, the specialist did not follow procedures. The doctor later attributed the lack of documentation to the fact that the 3-year-old was unable to explain what had happened to her, and he assumed the bruises were ones she had gotten at home. The doctor simply attributed it to an accident while playing, which the mother, as usual, began to narrate, and no action was taken. One September morning in 2016, the neighbor woke up to find that Poppy's troubled family had moved out. They had done so under the cover of night, as if intentionally avoiding unnecessary witnesses, which aroused suspicion. Nevertheless, Cobus did not give up his job, and the staff at the kindergarten Poppy attended were not informed of the move. In fact, the couple wanted to evade responsibility and avoid a medical examination where they had nearly been caught. The parents decided to disappear and move to their new residence. Luisa and Cobus traveled to the farm Mamogaliescral, which was several hours away from the town. There, they lived with Luisa's family. It was a rare occasion for Luisa and her mother, along with their children, to be in one place. In fact, she rarely allowed the little ones to spend time with their grandmother. Luisa's mother, who herself had lived with an abuser for years, was shocked when she saw the children's condition. Luisa's mother immediately noticed the numerous bruises that covered almost the entire bodies of the children. When the grandmother tried to find out from the boy where all these injuries came from, he said Cobus had beaten him. Meanwhile, Luisa denied the domestic violence and labeled Johann a liar. After this visit, the woman became worried about what was happening in her daughter's family, but she was afraid of hurting her. Therefore, she decided to confide only in her pastor. To her great regret, the The church pastor became angry instead of helping or at least supporting her. In the pastor's view, the grandmother should not interfere in her daughter's affairs since she was already married and should solve such problems herself. After that, Luisa's mother no longer contacted other services and did not try to help her grandchildren. On October 25, 2016, just 1 month after the family had refused medical examinations, Luisa ran into the local hospital with her daughter in her arms. She urgently demanded that medical staff help Poppy and perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation, stating that the girl had been unconscious for some time. All efforts were in vain. The staff immediately noticed the mother's suspicious behavior. It seemed as if she was completely indifferent to the child's fate. At the same time, she said she didn't want any trouble with the police. Even more suspicious were the child's injuries. Almost the entire body of the girl was one large bruise. When the mother was asked where all these bruises came from, she said her husband had rushed to the hospital because of the bad road, and the child had been severely shaken in the back seat of the car, causing bruises. This lie was quickly disproven. Bruises in various stages of healing were found on Poppy's body, indicating regular beatings of the girl. The bruises hadn't had time to disappear before new ones appeared. It was impossible to explain them by careless driving. The doctor noticed that the family had arrived with a second child. He immediately saw that 5-year-old Johan was cowering in a corner, trying to stay away from his parents and avoiding eye contact with adults. The child clenched his teeth and muttered something to himself. When asked what had happened, the boy replied, "Poppy doesn't want to eat anymore." Moreover, he had bruises on his body. All of this looked too suspicious and seemed to be connected to the incident in which a 3-year-old girl had died. So the doctor decided to call the police. Luisa and Cobus immediately tried to dissuade him, but the doctor ignored their words. When the first police officer arrived at the clinic, the doctor showed him a picture of Poppy's body. The police officer was a father himself. His child had just turned 1 year old. He was so stunned by the extent of the girl's mutilation that he wept. In his many years as a policeman, he had never seen such a mutilated body, not even that of an adult, let alone that of a little girl who had just learned to stand on her own feet. The stepfather was immediately taken to the police station, but Luisa was not detained because it was believed that she, like the children, had been a victim of domestic violence all these years. The true story of the 3-year-old's death will probably never be told. It was partially reconstructed based on witness statements, including a neighbor, a grandmother, the mother of the murdered girl, the murderer's statements, and physical evidence. But almost all the material contains inconsistencies and contradictions. While Cobus was taken to the station and interrogated, the officers decided to speak with Luisa. The woman said that the child had hit her head on a cupboard shortly before her death. This happened on the evening of October 24th. When the girl woke up the next day, she seemed to behave strangely. She appeared half asleep, inactive, barely spoke, and hardly moved. In the afternoon, Cobus returned from work. He was always in a bad mood, but that day Luisa asked him not to bully the children, who were unwell. But he didn't listen to her, and instead of greeting her, he kicked her in the stomach. According to the mother of the dead child, he did this almost every day. She didn't wait for the end of the beating and simply went shopping, and she recounted this quite calmly. When Luisa returned, Cobus said the girl was sick and had fainted. The mother found her daughter lying lifeless in the bathtub. She immediately noticed that the body was very cold and the lips were blue. They tried to resuscitate the girl, but it had no effect. They then decided to take her to the hospital and placed her on the back seat of a pickup truck. Then came one of the strangest parts of the story. Instead of carrying the 3-year-old girl in their arms, they threw her like an object into the empty cargo bed of the truck, where she slid around like a doll on the road's bumps. At the same time, this became a very convenient explanation for the numerous bruises that covered the deceased's body. When the grandmother saw the condition of her granddaughter, she simply couldn't believe that her own daughter could be involved. Like others, she didn't take seriously the idea that such injuries could occur from accidentally hitting a cupboard. According to investigators and the coroner, the child had been beaten for a long time, possibly even thrown against walls and furniture. According to the autopsy report, a large amount of blood had accumulated on the lower left side of the child's skull, characteristic of a severe head injury that could have been fatal. Abrasions were found all over the victim's body, particularly numerous on the face, chest, and thighs. It seemed as if the child had been kicked. This was confirmed by the victim's mother. Numerous other injuries were also found, indicating that the child had been the victim of a deliberate massacre. She had been systematically beaten over a long period. When the story reached the local community, attacks on Kobus began. During his detention, he was beaten multiple times and repeatedly threatened with death. However, Luisa, despite her complicity, did not seem to be targeted by the police. Gradually, the town's residents learned that she might have been involved in her daughter's death, just like the stepfather, and decided to take revenge on her. On the eve of the funeral, on November 4, 2016, Luisa was visited by two unknown women in police uniforms. They persuaded her to come with them to make a statement at the station. In reality, they took her out of town and severely beat her. It turned out that these women were not police officers, but locals who had decided to lynch her. In the end, Poppy's mother came to say goodbye to her child at the funeral in almost the same condition as the girl, but unlike her, still alive. Poppy's biological father, Christo van der Merwe, was seen crying during the farewell ceremony. He sat in the front row alongside friends and relatives. He blamed his ex-wife, who in his opinion had always been a bad mother, for everything. Luisa's face, which showed signs of a recent beating, displayed no remorse throughout the entire service, as if she were indifferent to her daughter's death. Luisa was arrested on December 15, 2016, facing the same charges as her husband. Despite the rapid progress of the case, the trial was postponed by a year. The hearings did not begin until October 2017. There were several reasons for this. The first was that there were no defense attorneys willing to represent the interests of the accused in court. The lawyers felt hostility toward the child murderers and refused to work with them. Furthermore, the constant attacks by fellow inmates forced Kobus to attempt suicide twice. Both times, the perpetrator's stomach was pumped, and he had to spend a long time recovering in the hospital. In any case, the postponement of the hearings was only to the prosecution's advantage. The additional time was enough to thoroughly question Johan, the brother of the dead girl. The boy claimed that his stepfather had beaten him and his sister daily, and the mother had simply watched quietly and even covered for her spouse, not trying to help them. According to the child, the beatings were so severe that the sounds of the blows were sometimes louder than their cries of pain. The boy's words were crucial in accusing his mother. Until the end, Luisa tried to justify herself. When she brought her daughter to the hospital, she claimed she had tried to revive her by splashing water on her face and performing resuscitation measures. Johan said that his sister was actually all wet, because after the beatings, her stepfather had dunked her head in the toilet and tried to bring her back to consciousness by flushing. During this procedure, according to Johan, the mother had simply stood in the doorway and watched without seriously trying to intervene. In the end, both were found guilty of the girl's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Additionally, each received another 10 years for endangering the life of their older child, who had miraculously survived the daily abuse. Even the judge was angry during the sentencing. He was not only outraged by the cruelty of these people, but also by their complete indifference to what had happened. All present agreed that the defendants were indifferent to the girl's death. They only cared about the punishment they would receive for it. During the trial, it became known that the neighbor had repeatedly appealed to social services to investigate the family for child abuse, but no one had responded to his appeals or rescued the children. Subsequently, the social workers, who should have contacted law enforcement, justified themselves by citing the distance and bureaucratic difficulties that prevented them from responding to the family's abuse. They were not held accountable for their negligence. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.
19-year-old student Yvonne Johnson flew to her parents' house to spend the summer holidays. She couldn't have imagined how her vacation would end. What Yvonne experienced in the last minutes of her life was hell. This tragic story happened in 2005 and shook much of South Asia. It is a story about power, influence, and justice, about how unfair life can sometimes be. Yvonne Johnson was born in Sri Lanka in August 1985 to Roger, a Swede, and Chamalka, a Sri Lankan. Yvonne was the eldest daughter. Caroline, the younger daughter, also grew up in the Johnson family. Friends described Yvonne as a kind, gentle, and hard-working person. She was a role model for many. Yvonne dreamed of becoming a fashion designer since childhood. For this reason, she moved to the USA in early 2005 to study at a design school. The Johnson family was wealthy, and her parents helped their eldest daughter move to another country. At the end of June 2005, Yvonne returned home for the holidays and stayed with her parents, who at the time lived in the exclusive Royal Park gated community in Rajagiriya. June and July are the peak summer holiday season worldwide. Yvonne returned home for a short time to relax, see friends, visit familiar places, and simply enjoy nature. Yvonne spent most of her time with her parents and her sister Caroline, who was 17 at the time. Caroline had recently started dating a 19-year-old boy named Jude Shramantha Jayamaha. Yvonne and Jude used to attend the same international school in Colombo. They were never friends, had never spoken, but had met in the school corridors. In the summer of 2005, Yvonne, Caroline, and Jude began going out together, partying in clubs and having a carefree time. It was Friday, June 30th. That day, big parties were planned in almost all of Colombo's nightclubs. Yvonne and Caroline decided to have some fun. At 8 p.m., the sisters asked their father Roger if they could take his blue Jeep to visit friends in the neighboring city of Colombo. Their father replied, "Yes, I'll allow you to go in pairs, but please come back together." The Johnson sisters got into the Jeep and drove off. They went to Jude's house. He lived in a luxurious house. His parents weren't ordinary people, but rather well-known businessmen in Colombo. They owned a popular restaurant and a catering company that provided food for large events and parties. Yvonne and Caroline picked Jude up around 8:30 p.m., and the three of them drove to a bar called the White Horse. At the White Horse, they met four of their friends. The young people chatted and had a few drinks. Eventually, they got bored and decided to go somewhere else, to a club called Glow. When they arrived at Glow, it turned out to be even more boring. There were very few people there, the music was bad, and there was no DJ. The friends turned around, got in their car, and drove to another bar called the Blue Elephant, located near the Hilton Colombo Hotel. It was more fun there, but the group didn't stay long. They soon reached the hotel, where they met another friend from Korea. After 20 minutes, the group returned to the Blue Elephant. It was already 12:30 a.m. Yvonne, Caroline, Jude, and their 5 friends were drinking and dancing at the Blue Elephant. There, a strange situation occurred. Inside the bar, Caroline noticed an old acquaintance waving to her from a distance. She approached him. They chatted briefly and then returned to their respective friends. Jude didn't like this situation. He may have thought a stranger was flirting with Caroline, and she was reciprocating his advances. Soon, the friends noticed Jude and Caroline starting to argue. Jude was very angry and screamed loudly. Caroline began to cry. Unfortunately, there is no precise information about how the events unfolded. Loud music was playing in the bar. According to Jude, Yvonne interfered with the conflict and took his side. Jude said that Yvonne agreed that Caroline was wrong and that Jude had done the right thing by insulting her. She deserved it. Caroline, however, told a completely different story. According to her, Yvonne intervened in the conflict and insulted Jude in front of everyone present for upsetting Caroline. Yvonne said he had no right to yell at her sister in front of so many people. After the argument, everyone's mood was bad. Jude and Caroline told everyone it was time to go home. Yvonne and her Korean friend decided to stay at the bar and dance a little longer. After a while, they returned to Club Glow. Soon after, the Korean woman went home, leaving Yvonne alone in the club. At 2 a.m., Jude and Caroline arrived at the Royal Park apartment complex. They went up to the 23rd floor together. Caroline invited Jude into her apartment and led him into the bedroom. They locked the door. The parents were asleep in the next room. After 30 minutes, the boy called a taxi and left. At 6 a.m., on July 1st, Roger Johnson woke up and began getting ready for work. Before leaving, he entered Caroline's room, but his younger daughter was not there. The man became restless. He then went to Yvonne's room and found the door locked from the inside. Roger thought his daughters were asleep together and did not wake them. He went to his sleeping wife and asked, "Did the girls fall asleep in Yvonne's room?" His sleepy wife replied, "Yes, they came back very late and are still asleep." Roger calmed down and took a deep breath. He left the apartment, called the elevator, and while waiting, saw a note Caroline had left for Yvonne. It read, "Wake me when you get home." Roger read the note but didn't attach any particular importance to it. He got into the elevator and left. Several hours passed. Chamalka woke up and went to Yvonne's room to wake her daughters. But it turned out that only Caroline was asleep in bed. Yvonne wasn't home. Caroline woke up and began getting ready for school. Her mother asked where Yvonne was. Caroline replied that she didn't know anything. Caroline was already late. She hurriedly texted her friend Jude that her sister hadn't come home after the party. Jude replied, "She's probably still having fun." Afterward, Caroline called her Korean friend who had stayed at the bar with Yvonne. The Korean woman reported that she and Yvonne had returned to Club Glow. She then drove home, while Yvonne remained alone at the club. Chamalka and Caroline were worried but still hoped that Yvonne would return soon. At 9 a.m., they left the house, got into the car, and the driver took them to school. On the way, Chamalka felt unwell. The woman was very worried. She asked the driver to turn around and take her home. At this time, the Royal Park apartment complex became very busy. Residents left their apartments one after the other to go jogging, to work, or to school. The Korean friend Yvonne had last seen also lived in the Royal Park, only on the 16th floor. Shortly after 10 a.m. that morning, the Korean woman's housekeeper, a woman named Sheila Anthony, came to her apartment as usual to clean up and prepare lunch. The apartment owner asked Sheila to deliver some things to the neighbors upstairs. Sheila called the elevator to take her from the 16th to the 19th floor, but the wait was too long. The woman decided to walk up. When she reached the stairs leading to the 19th floor, she saw a horrific sight, a young woman lying in a pool of blood. Sheila screamed. She tripped on a step, fell, and landed hard. When she came to, she ran to the building manager's office and reported her terrible discovery. At first, the building manager laughed at Sheila and said she probably just saw a ghost. Then the man himself went up to the 19th floor and looked at the stairs. The manager saw blood and a corpse, which was lying in a strange position. He thought it was a doll, and someone had decided to play a prank on them. Unfortunately, it was neither a ghost nor a doll. The young woman's lower body was exposed. Her jeans were pulled down to her ankles and wrapped around her neck. She had been strangled, and her head was badly smashed. The caretaker immediately recognized the dead woman. It was 19-year-old Yvonne Johnson. The police arrived at the scene. At that time, no one was in the Johnsons' apartment. Soon after, Chamalka and Caroline arrived at the building. They went up to the 23rd floor. There, they were met by police officers. They were shown a photo that had been found in the deceased's handbag. Chamalka and Caroline recognized the photo of Yvonne. They immediately realized that something terrible had happened. The officers called Roger and urgently asked him to come home. The man left all his professional obligations and rushed to Royal Park. There, he was told the terrible news. Roger refused to believe this was true. He decided he wanted to see Yvonne and went to the place where the young woman had been found. Caroline followed her father. What father and daughter saw on the stairs shocked them. Caroline remained silent for days. She was so shocked that she couldn't speak a word. Using the coroner's report, the officers tried to reconstruct what had happened to Yvonne that night. As Yvonne was returning home, someone encountered her near her apartment on the 23rd floor. Something happened there, and Yvonne quickly ran down the stairs. The assailant caught up with her. A struggle ensued. She suffered severe injuries to both ankles. She managed to free herself and ran down the stairs again, leaving gruesome marks. Earrings and other objects were scattered on the stairs. On the 19th floor, the assailant caught up with Yvonne again and violently hit her head on the floor. Her skull shattered into 63 pieces. The killer then removed her jeans, tied them around her neck, and strangled her. He then took her wallet from her handbag and fled from Royal Park. According to the autopsy report, Yvonne Johnson's cause of death was suffocation with her jeans. Police sealed the crime scene and questioned all family members and friends of the deceased. Officers quickly learned about the party and the argument between Caroline and Jude and how Yvonne's last hours had unfolded. Caroline said that her boyfriend Jude hadn't called or texted her for almost a whole day after the tragedy, something that had never happened before. They were in constant contact. Investigators were interested in Jude. They summoned Chamalka and Caroline for questioning and asked them to provide as many details as possible about this young man. Yvonne and Jude had known each other since they were 9 years old. They attended the same school in Colombo. Caroline admitted that Jude had never liked Yvonne and had tried to dissuade her from a relationship with this boy. Yvonne told her mother that Jude was very spoiled, used illegal substances, and had alcohol problems. He also had problems in his family that affected his mental health. Yvonne confessed to her mother and sister that Jude had been expelled from the international school in Colombo for bringing illegal substances onto the school premises. Jude also changed his girlfriends like gloves. Nevertheless, Caroline decided to give the boy a chance and began dating him in February 2005, when her sister had already moved to the USA. Yvonne was very angry. During the interrogation, Chamalka added that Caroline was an excellent student. But after she started dating Jude, her grades dropped drastically. The police discovered that Jude's parents divorced when he was 11. And during those 11 years, his mother and father argued constantly. Jude stayed with his father, who immediately brought a new wife home. Since childhood, Jude had been disobedient and violent. He changed schools several times and then went to Australia, where he studied at the University of Economics. At the time of the tragedy, he, like Yvonne, had flown to Sri Lanka for a holiday. After the tragedy at Royal Park, Jude disappeared. He broke off contact and didn't answer calls or messages. He didn't get back in touch for a day. Jude went to the Johnson family's apartment to express his condolences. When they saw the boy, Yvonne's parents immediately called the police. Jude was taken to the police station and told the investigators his story. The boy did not hide the fact that he had argued with Caroline at the party because he was jealous of another boy. According to Jude, Yvonne supported him and shamed her sister. He said that he and Caroline returned to the Johnson family's apartment in Royal Park around 2 a.m., where they slept together. 30 minutes later, he took a taxi home. According to Jude, he hadn't seen Yvonne and didn't know what had happened to her that terrible night. After the interrogation, the investigators began to verify the man's statement. They contacted his friends and found the taxi Jude had taken that night. Gradually, his lie came to light. Jude's close friend, Mohammed Shafraz, reported that Jude had called him on the night of June 30th to July 1st and asked him to pick him up from Royal Park. At first, Mohammed refused because it was already too late. However, Jude asked him to keep coming and promised that if he helped him now, he would remain his friend forever. After much persuasion, Mohammed finally agreed. At around 2:50 a.m., he took a taxi to Royal Park. There, Jude ran up to the car in his shirt and underwear, holding a pair of jeans. The taxi driver who had brought Mohammed also confirmed this. It later emerged that Jude had been wearing different clothes at the party. He was wearing a different shirt and pants. During the investigation, it emerged that a partial bloody palm print was found on the railing of the 19th floor, which matched Jude's. During questioning, the young man stated that before getting into a taxi and leaving, he visited the condominium's swimming pool, where he showered and changed into clean clothes. The trial began. The prosecution presented numerous pieces of evidence against Jude Shramantha Jayamaha: the palm print, the argument at the party, Yvonne's personal dislike, and the fact that Jude's clothes, which he had worn that evening in the clubs and bars, were never found. The defense, for its part, presented its version of events. They claimed that the palm print only partially matched, and this could not be considered proof. According to the lawyer, Jude and Caroline had intimate contact. For this reason, the young man went to the pool, showered, freshened up, and changed his clothes. Caroline incidentally denied having slept with Jude that night. She reported that they argued for 30 minutes in her room and clarified their relationship. The defense also presented a pair of shoes that had been handed over to the police. Jude had spent the entire evening and night in these shoes, and not a drop of Yvonne's blood was found on them. The lawyer repeatedly claimed that there was no enmity between Jude and Yvonne. He had no motive to eliminate Yvonne in such a cruel manner. On July 28, 2006, the court found Jude guilty. The young man was sentenced to life imprisonment. Everyone who had followed the case breathed a sigh of relief that the perpetrator had been punished. However, many continued to believe that Jude had been lucky and had escaped the death penalty. 7 years after the tragedy, in 2012, Jude filed an appeal. As a result, the Attorney General of Sri Lanka demanded a harsher sentence and that Jude be transferred to death row. And so it happened. Jude was sentenced to death. The Johnson family and the people of Sri Lanka rejoiced. People believed in the justice of the legal system. Everyone felt that the murderer had finally received his just punishment. But the joy was premature. In 2015, there was a change of power in Sri Lanka. Maithripala Sirisena became president. He had the right to pardon criminals sentenced to death. In November 2019, Maithripala Sirisena pardoned Jude, who had already spent 14 years in prison. It is worth noting that during these 14 years behind bars, Jude had access to a mobile phone. His relatives and friends could visit him at any time. He was treated differently than other inmates. It turned out that Maithripala Sirisena was a distant relative of Jude. More specifically, Jude's stepmother was related to the president. In 2019, Jude pleaded guilty and was pardoned, as he was only 19 at the time of the verdict. Jude, now 34, was released. He then immediately fled Sri Lanka to another country, presumably Singapore. In November 2024, thanks to activists and the media, the court reopened the Yvonne Johnson murder case. It was decided to return Jude to death row, but first the man had to be found. Singapore authorities declared Jude to be in their country. He remains at large to this day. No one knows his whereabouts. Caroline Johnson left her homeland many years ago and married. In one of her last media interviews, she said, "I will never return to Sri Lanka. This country has destroyed my life and that of my family. I lost my sister and my home. I will fight until Jude receives the punishment he deserves." Thanks for watching, and take care. There is no Hollywood script in this story, no mysterious masks, and no loud gunfire, but there is a woman whose name is now known throughout the country. It all began with ordinary meetings, confidential conversations, and promises of help, and it ended with sudden deaths. How did she manage to go unnoticed for so many years? And why didn't anyone suspect anything earlier? It is a story in which each new fact is more shocking than the last. Stay until the end, as you will not believe how far it went. The story we are talking about today is not just frightening, it is terrifying because of how ordinary everything was. It is not a movie, nor is it a fabrication. Ordinary people, such as relatives, friends, and colleagues, disappeared or died one after another, and no one connected these events until it was too late. We will examine in detail how Sararat Rangsiwuthaporn, smiling and silent, became the focus of a series of poisonings. It all began around 10 or 11 a.m. A woman went down to the river to release fish into the water. This is a traditional custom in Thailand, believed to bring good luck and prosperity. But suddenly, something unexpected happened. The woman suddenly fell to the ground. Passers-by immediately rushed to her aid and found her unconscious. They immediately called an ambulance. By the time paramedics arrived and began resuscitation, it was already too late. The woman had died. Doctors suspected the cause of death was acute cardiopulmonary failure, likely caused by accidental circumstances. The deceased was identified as Siraporn Khan Wong, also known as Koi. She was 32 years old and a successful entrepreneur from Kanchanaburi province. However, her parents were convinced that her mysterious death was no accident, as she had no underlying health problems. Furthermore, several valuable items were discovered missing after her death, including cash, 2 smartphones, an iPhone 14 Pro Max, an Oppo, her wallet, and her car. These circumstances raised serious doubts about the true cause of her death. At the parents' urging, the authorities launched a more thorough investigation. Upon reviewing surveillance camera footage from near the scene, it became clear that Koi had come to the river with her friend Sararat Rangsiwuthaporn. Both women had come to release fish into the river. Initially, they walked together but then separated. Koi walked toward the river, while Sararat crossed the street. The video shows Sararat standing and looking toward the river, appearing to search for something. After pacing back and forth for a bit, she seems to ask someone a question. She appears confused and points in another direction. She then walks to the end of the path and again displays strange and confused behavior, which is especially odd considering she arrived with a friend. The cameras then filmed her running to the car, taking out an object, and going down the stairs to the river where Koi was. After a short time, however, she returned, got into the car, and drove away as if nothing had happened. To describe this behavior as strange would be an understatement. According to Koi's family, she and Sararat were supposed to release the fish together. So why did Sararat leave when Koi lost consciousness? Why didn't she stay to help her friend? Why didn't she call for help? Such questions were undoubtedly on her relatives' minds. Later, the police found Koi's car at an acquaintance's house. According to surveillance camera recordings, Koi first drove to Sararat's house, from where Sararat drove them both to the river. However, other missing items belonging to Koi, including her cash, smartphones, and wallet, were never found. During her interview with the police, Sarah Rat initially denied her involvement in the incident and insisted that she had not been at the riverbank that day. However, after being shown the surveillance camera footage, she changed her story and admitted that she had indeed been at the scene. She explained her sudden disappearance by claiming that urgent matters had arisen, requiring her immediate departure. Sarah Rat stated that she had noticed Koi's health deteriorating, but since other people were already there to help, she decided that her friend was fine and did not need her assistance. Regarding the missing items, it later emerged that Sarah Rat had mailed them to one of her acquaintances. The package was sent on April 19, and inside were Koi's wallet, her Oppo phone, and her handbag. The remaining items were never found. However, almost no one believed this story, especially Rapi Chamnanrua. He played a key role in uncovering the truth about Sarah Rat's actions. From the moment he saw the CCTV footage, he felt something was wrong. But even he could not imagine how deep this story truly ran. If Sarah Rat was truly responsible for Koi's death, how did she do it? Poisoning seemed the most likely method. However, the initial toxicology analysis revealed no traces of poison in Koi's body. The woman's mysterious death quickly became the main topic in the news and sparked widespread public outrage. Soon, the phones in newsrooms and police stations began ringing non-stop. People reported that their close friends and relatives also knew Sarah Rat and had died under mysterious circumstances after meeting her. One detail was particularly disturbing. Many of the victims were found to have darkened fingernails at the time of their deaths. From 2020 to 2023, there were at least 15 such victims. Yes, no fewer than 15 victims in just 3 years. If Sarah Rat was truly involved in all these deaths, how did she manage to avoid suspicion and elude the police for so long? Sarah Rat was arrested, and the news of this case immediately spread throughout the country. People began to actively discuss who else might have been her victim. Soon, another woman came forward. She claimed to have lent Sarah Rat 250,000 baht, approximately $7,700. According to her, Sarah Rat offered her a pill when they met at a mall. After taking it, the woman felt severe pressure in her chest and numbness in her hands. Fortunately, she was taken to the hospital in time, and her life was saved. Let's take a closer look at who Sarah Rat actually is. At the time of her arrest, she was 36 years old. Her ex-husband, Vitun Rangsuithaporn, worked for the police. After their wedding, the couple moved into police housing, where they had 2 children. Over time, Vitun advanced in his career and rose to the rank of police lieutenant colonel, which secured a higher standard of living for the family, allowing them to move into a new house. Despite their eventual divorce, Sarah Rat and Vitun maintained a close relationship, likely for the sake of their children. It is unknown exactly when Sarah Rat developed her propensity for murder, but among the alleged victims was reportedly her latest lover. In Sarah Rat's life, deaths under unexplained circumstances occurred with suspicious frequency. One of these cases was her boyfriend Suthisak De Phungkwan. He died under suspicious circumstances on March 12, 2023, just a month before Koi's mysterious death. The pathologist listed the cause of his death as acute cardiopulmonary failure. It was Sarah Rat who called the police, presenting herself as his girlfriend and claiming to be pregnant with his child. At the time, nothing seemed strange to anyone. Later, however, it emerged that Sarah Rat was celebrating her birthday with friends on the evening Day died. No one in their right mind would do something like that immediately after the death of a loved one. On March 18, 2023, just days after his death, Sarah Rat pawned Day's gold jewelry and took control of all his assets. At that time, this did not seem unusual to Day's family. They were convinced that Sarah Rat was indeed expecting his child and, as the mother of his future heir, was entitled to his entire fortune. However, a close friend of Day's who wished to remain anonymous immediately began to suspect that things were not so simple. He found it particularly alarming that Sararat quickly packed up all of Day's personal belongings from his room and moved them away, leaving the room completely empty. The media spoke to this man, whom we will call Mr. Kung. He had known Day since childhood and was convinced that the child Sararat was expecting was actually his friend's. According to him, Day met Sararat in December 2022 through a dating app. Sararat often boasted about using micro-loans to pawn cars and real estate, as well as her involvement in stock trading. She also emphasized several times that her ex-husband held a high position in the police force, assuring everyone that he would take care of any problems that arose. Mayday's girlfriend remembers the day he first introduced Sararat. That was on March 11. When she returned from work, she saw Day sitting on a marble bench in front of their house with a woman. At first, she didn't know who it was, but then she remembered Day mentioning that his new female friend was coming over that day. May noticed that Day was behaving unusually. He was serious and quiet, completely different from his usual self. While they sat on the bench, Sararat did most of the talking. She asked him what he used to do and if he had other women. After the visit, they left together. On the day of his death, Sararat called May and said that something was wrong with Day, claiming he was bleeding heavily. When May arrived, other people were already in the room, including Sararat. All of this happened before the police arrived. Day was lying on the bed, wearing only his underwear, with blood on his lips. May noticed that his fingernails were dark, but his body was still warm. At that moment, she thought Day might be under the influence of illegal substances or, as is sometimes believed in Thailand, the victim of witchcraft. May also noticed that Day usually carried a lot of cash, but on the day of his death, there were fewer than 10 baht in his pockets. After Day's death, some of his relatives recalled that he had once told a story about witnessing a murder committed by Sararat. He had called her a cruel woman. This further aroused their suspicions, and they decided to search his apartment thoroughly. They made a horrific discovery, a bottle labeled UN 1680, which is potassium cyanide. Potassium cyanide is an extremely toxic substance that can cause death within minutes of ingestion. It is odorless and tasteless, meaning it can be mixed unnoticed into food or drinks. The victim is usually unaware of the poisoning until it is too late. Symptoms appear quickly and include breathing difficulties, confusion, and unconsciousness. Depending on the dose and method of ingestion, it can lead to death in as little as 15 minutes. Detecting the presence of cyanide in the body requires special laboratory tests of blood and tissue for cyanide ions or their metabolites, which significantly complicates the investigation of suspicious deaths. In Thailand, cyanide is primarily used in the mining industry to extract gold and silver. Although the use of cyanide is strictly regulated, it can still be found in certain types of pesticides and fumigants. Forensic experts were able to detect traces of cyanide in the car that Sararat had shared with her ex-husband. The police subsequently obtained a search warrant for her ex-husband's home, where they found a large quantity of unidentified medications and empty capsules. The ex-husband claimed he had no idea where they came from. Similar items were also found at Sararat's mother's home. All of the suspicious substances found were later identified as cyanide. In May 2023, the Provincial Police Department in Ratchaburi presented the results of the autopsy on Koi's body. The report confirmed that cyanide had indeed been found in her system. Afterwards, Sararat refused to comment on Koi's death. Upon her arrest, she made a truly outrageous statement. She claimed that Koi herself had wanted to take illegal substances laced with cyanide, and she had merely helped her fulfill that wish. She also claimed to have received the cyanide from her deceased boyfriend. Honestly, it is almost impossible to make this stuff up. What this woman said is beyond absurd. One gets the impression that she thinks the whole world is absolutely naive if she expects anyone to believe these ridiculous justifications. So many people around her were dying from cyanide poisoning, and in her opinion, all of it was pure coincidence. She acted as if cyanide were the most common substance on the planet, which is simply incomprehensible. The police carefully investigated all the fatalities and established a connection between them. Each of the victims had some sort of connection with Sararat, primarily through financial relationships. What is truly astonishing is that even police officers were among the victims. They likely met Sararat through her ex-husband's connections. If even police officers could not escape danger, who could feel safe? Sararat spared no one, not even her school friends. This meant that anyone who interacted with her could potentially become a victim. One of her fraud schemes involved participation in a Rosca savings group. This is a system in which participants regularly contribute a fixed amount of money to a common fund which is then distributed in full to one of the participants each time until everyone has received their share. The entire system is based on trust and is interest-free. It is an affordable alternative to traditional loans, especially in Southeast Asia, where such groups are popular for saving money for large purchases or unforeseen expenses. You could say it is a kind of people's bank where individuals help one another. While the Rosca scheme was the basis for many of her scams, Sararat also used other financial tricks that essentially amounted to the same thing. The victim simply did not live long enough to profit from them. For example, she borrowed money from people at high interest rates. The terms seemed advantageous for the lender, provided they lived long enough to be repaid. She also ran schemes involving shadow lending and gambling. In all of these operations, Sararat appropriated the money and then disappeared without a trace, moving on to another unsuspecting victim. One might think she was targeting wealthy people, but the opposite was true. Sararat sought out those in desperate financial straits. She seemed to unerringly sense which fraud scheme would work best on a particular individual to maximize her own profit. Often, she extracted much more money from her victims than they actually had. This is exactly what happened to one of her victims, Nitya. Her tragic story unfolded in August 2020. Nitya owned a Honda Civic, which she pawned on Sararat's advice. They went out for drinks together that evening. Shortly afterward, Nitya was found unconscious face down in a bathroom. Her face was darkly discolored. Doctors at the time ruled that her death was due to cardiopulmonary failure, and her family had no idea that anything was wrong. At that point, Nitya had known Sararat for about 3 to 4 months, having met her through the Rosca group. What truly shocked the family was this. Shortly after the funeral, they received a call informing them that Nitya's car had indeed been pawned. The family members were completely stunned. They had no idea where the money was, who had received it, or why this had all happened. The most painful part, however, was that many families who fell into such a trap had to pay additional sums just to get the deceased's property, such as their cars, back. Ultimately, these families lost not only a loved one but also their money and their hope for justice. In reality, the money was with Sararat, who had defrauded the victims in advance and convinced them to hand over the cash for safekeeping. Sararat acted so quickly to eliminate her targets that their families could not even grasp what was happening in time. Naturally, Sararat then disappeared with the money. This is exactly how most of her scams worked, and the pattern was repeated over and over again. Furthermore, in some cases, the families of Sararat's victims could not afford to buy back the pawned cars, which allowed Sararat to keep the vehicles for herself, causing additional emotional pain to the deceased's relatives. The most heinous part, however, was that Sararat even hired a lawyer to demand additional payments from the victims' families, further exacerbating their financial problems. One has to wonder if her lawyer was knowingly involved in these scams or simply turned a blind eye to make easy money. Sararat committed the murders in the following way. She would invite the victim to a religious ceremony, to see a fortune teller, or to have lunch at a temple. When they met, Sararat offered them food or drinks laced with cyanide. It is even said that during the pandemic, she distributed diet pills containing cyanide. This is truly frightening, and it makes you think twice before drinking coffee made by a friend. The police continue to investigate the victims who died from cyanide poisoning. For example, one woman died on April 1, 2023. CCTV cameras recorded Sararat sitting next to a police officer named Nipa in a temple that day. Nipa gave Sararat money, and Sararat invited her to see a fortune teller. What happened next, unfortunately, cannot be shown on YouTube because it is entirely restricted content. Investigators were determined to find out where Sararat had obtained the cyanide. To everyone's surprise, they discovered that it was being sold in a shop in central Bangkok. In fact, the shop in question had sold more than 1,500 bottles of cyanide, and it became clear that this lethal substance could easily be purchased online. The disturbing question arises: how many similar poisoners could be hiding in Thailand? After all, there have been previous cases of cyanide poisoning in this country. One of the methods Sararat used to earn money was through life insurance. The victim would take out an insurance policy that served as collateral in case they could not repay their debts. However, in the event of the insured's death, Sararat would become the beneficiary, meaning the death had to look natural. Cyanide fit this plan perfectly. If toxicologists did not specifically look for traces of cyanide in the deceased's body, the death would appear natural. In this way, Sararat calmly received one insurance payout after another. According to investigators' estimates, Sararat was able to swindle hundreds of thousands of dollars through these and other schemes. The police discovered 108 bank accounts with a total of 78 million baht, approximately $2.4 million. She could have become even richer, but rumors suggest she gambled away much of the money. Of course, she cannot be called a victim, as all of her money is literally stained with blood. The police chief stated that the deceased Khoi's assets had been pawned in a pawn shop under Sararat's name, which became one of the most important pieces of evidence against her. Upon her arrest, she refused to admit her guilt. Her former husband and her lawyer were also arrested. However, the court later released the lawyer because no direct evidence of his involvement in Sararat's crimes was found. At the time of her arrest, Sararat was 4 months pregnant, but after several months in prison, she suffered a miscarriage. The reaction on social media was brutal, with some writing that she deserved it. Public opinion was extremely hostile, as many of her victims were their family's primary breadwinners, and one of them had recently become a mother. According to the investigation, Sararat had been defrauding and killing people since 2015, remaining uncaught for years. It is suspected that after one of her first victims, a woman named Munthathip Sai Kowin, she developed a taste for killing and recognized the massive potential for profit. Sararat had offered to look after Sai's property while she was abroad. When Sai returned to Thailand, Sararat personally picked her up from the airport and brought her home. The next day, Sai was found dead. After her death, Sararat sold Sai's house and appropriated the money. Research shows that female killers usually act for financial gain, while men are more likely to be driven by cruelty or dark fantasies. However, the sheer number of her victims, regardless of her motives, puts Sararat on a par with the world's most notorious serial killers. Finally, in November 2024, Sararat Rangsuwathaporn was found guilty of Khoi's murder in the first of 14 trials and was sentenced to death. Meanwhile, her ex-husband was sentenced to 16 months in prison for destroying evidence and aiding Sararat's escape. The death penalty is the sentence for just one of the 14 murders. But even now, after so many deaths and months of investigation, questions remain. Who helped her, and how many more people could have been her victims? What does a person feel who is capable of killing again and again, calmly and without fear? Sararat remains silent, but her actions speak for themselves, and more trials and verdicts are still to come. This story is not over yet. Thailand is still recovering from the extent of this toxic web. Life, a
Bist in
woman, and
Vertrauen.
poison were all
Das
dissolved
Schrecklichste
in
an dieser
trust.
Geschichte ist vielleicht,
Perhaps the most
wie leicht sich der
horrifying thing
Tod hinter
about
einem
this
Lächeln
story
und einer
is how
Tasse Kaffee
easily
versteckt.
death hid behind a smile and a cup of coffee. How often do we look at the people around us and fail to see their true faces? Thanks for watching, and stay safe. The story of the Brazilian Flor de Lis dos Santos de Souza initially resembled a fairy tale. Born into a poor family and raised in one of the most crime-ridden neighborhoods of Rio de Janeiro, she managed to build what many called an empire. She became an influential spiritual leader, pursued a career in politics and showbiz, achieved international fame, and was even nicknamed the Mother of the Nation. But this image collapsed overnight when the dark side of her life came to light. Behind the facade of a successful and powerful woman lay a whole world of financial fraud, chaotic personal relationships, planned violence, and a group of followers ready to carry out their mother's every command. Flor de Lis dos Santos de Souza was born on February 5, 1961 in the municipality of Jacarezinho, one of the poorest neighborhoods in northern Rio. She was the youngest of two children. Her father was a creative artist and musician who played several instruments. But despite his talents, the family always had little money. Her mother, Arlete, earned extra money by babysitting the neighbors' children. The childhood of Flor de Lis and her older brother could hardly be described as carefree. They lived in a neighborhood plagued by poverty, banditry, and smuggling. The neighborhood covered 40 hectares, the equivalent of 50 football fields, and housed more than 65,000 people. Their house was small, dilapidated, and built on unstable ground. Clean water and sewage disposal were a luxury. Many residents didn't even know what a plumbing system was. Due to the unsanitary conditions, infections were a constant problem. The 1970s were particularly difficult, with unemployment and rising crime, but the residents stuck together, helped each other, and demanded that the authorities build schools and hospitals. Unfortunately, everything that was built quickly fell into disrepair. There was a lack of money, and gangs took over the territory. During these difficult years, Flor de Lis helped her mother with the children. But life in Jacarezinho became increasingly dangerous. At precisely this time, missionaries and street preachers appeared in the slums, bringing the word of God and hope to those who had almost none left. For many, faith became salvation. The Pentecostals, charismatic preachers who drew crowds, had a particularly strong influence. Flor de Lis's parents quickly joined this movement. Her father began holding prayer meetings in his home, which increasingly attracted large numbers of people. He believed that he had received a special spiritual gift after his baptism. Flor de Lis herself had been deeply religious since childhood. She not only believed, she was convinced that faith could heal, fulfill dreams, and change destinies. She sang in the church choir, and her vocal abilities quickly set her apart from the others. She often sang as a soloist. Gradually, following her father, Flor de Lis began leading prayer meetings herself. Already as a teenager, she recognized her ability to influence people. She attracted people, her energy and conviction fascinated them. She sincerely believed that she was saving those she was leading to faith and felt she had to continue her mission as far as possible. Even at school, Flor de Lis began to feel chosen, as if she had been entrusted with a special mission. This sense of destiny played a decisive role in her future. Soon she became a mentor and preacher herself. Fragile and petite, she fearlessly entered the most dangerous corners of the neighborhood, where crime and the trade in illicit substances reigned. Her speeches about faith, forgiveness, and hope made even hardened gangsters listen. Few people could have such an impact on others, but Flor de Lis had the gift of persuasion. In 1975, when she was only 14 years old, something terrible happened. Her father and older brother were killed in a car accident. Only she and her mother survived. But Flor de Lis did not break down. She decided that this was a test from God to strengthen her faith. She soon persuaded her mother to rent a room for prayer meetings. Even then, her charismatic leadership was awakening within her. Her sermons were inspiring, and her following grew. At 20, Fleur-de-Lis married. Little is known about her first husband. He was a deeply religious man. They met at her lectures. The marriage produced 3 sons. Despite the poverty in the community, the family seemed strong, but at 30, Fleur-de-Lis became a widow. Alone with her children, she again relied on her mother for support. Together, they opened a kindergarten in their home, and on weekends, Fleur-de-Lis continued to preach. Her audience grew, but over time her relationship with her congregation became almost fanatical. Her focus shifted. Now she spoke less about God and more about herself. She began to talk about visions and gifts from above. She claimed to receive messages from God in her dreams. She prophesied the future and called herself a preacher for lost souls. Against the backdrop of rising crime in Rio, Fleur-de-Lis decided to take action. With a group of followers, she went to the most dangerous places and persuaded gangsters and addicts to take the right path. Teenagers in particular were the focus of her efforts, as she believed they could still be reformed, and she succeeded. She won them over with her sincerity and motherly care, telling stories of how she had convinced gangsters to release her simply by remaining calm. For many, she became a prophet. There were rumors that she had been sent by God himself. In the early 1990s, Fleur-de-Lis opened a kind of youth home. There, the young people were provided with food, a roof over their heads, and, more importantly, the feeling of being part of a family. It seemed like an ideal story, but the more power and influence she gained, the more terrifying its dark side became. From the outside, everything appeared noble. Fleur-de-Lis was helping young people, and her reputation in society grew. But soon, the first oddities began to emerge. It turned out that far from all of her charges were orphans or homeless. Many had simply run away from home because of disputes with their parents. Fleur-de-Lis didn't ask unnecessary questions. Her doors were open to everyone. She didn't formally adopt these children, but simply let them live with her. The authorities turned a blind eye for a long time, even though the situation was beyond suspicious. There were no rules in her house. One could come and go as one pleased and stay as long as one wished. Rumors spread quickly. At Fleur-de-Lis's, there was free food and complete freedom. Eventually, hordes of young people flocked to her, which greatly angered the parents whose children had fled to their savior. But for her charges, she remained a holy woman. The most important thing was that her charges were well-fed and content. Many were baptized under her influence and began to believe that she was their spiritual mother. Over time, there was no room left in her house. Young people flocked to her from all parts of Rio. In 1992, 15-year-old Anderson do Carmo, a boy from a troubled family, moved in with her. He quickly became the family's favorite. Fleur-de-Lis singled him out from the others. He was tall, athletic, and handsome. Everyone thought he was with her eldest daughter, Simone. They looked like a couple, but things turned out differently. As soon as Anderson turned 18, he and Fleur-de-Lis moved in together, and a year later, they officially announced their relationship. The age difference was 16 years. There were rumors that their relationship had begun before he came of age, but they never commented. Despite the criticism, the couple seemed happy. They preached together, founded their own church, and ran an orphanage that Fleur-de-Lis had established before their marriage. A year after the wedding, a strange incident occurred. A woman came to Fleur-de-Lis in tears, threw a newborn baby at her feet, and begged her for help. Fleur-de-Lis took the baby in and later had it adopted. Soon after, the woman returned with other mothers and a group of children. They were allegedly left without care due to the unrest in the city. Despite the cramped conditions, Fleur-de-Lis took them all in. The story of the preacher who saved children spread through the media, interviews, television programs, articles. Philanthropists donated money to her home. Soon, the whole world was talking about her, from Brazil to Europe. But the greater her fame, the more closely the authorities looked. Soon the truth came to light. It turned out that Flordelis had no legal rights whatsoever to all these young people living in her home. Moreover, she had no money to support them. The children came and went as they pleased, without any control. Many actually had families who now demanded that Flordelis be punished for depriving minors of their liberty. A loud scandal ensued. The authorities initiated criminal proceedings. In response, Flordelis quickly gathered all her charges and moved to another parish. But that didn't help. The legal proceedings continued. Flordelis called a press conference and declared that she wanted to publicly justify herself. Journalists flocked to the event. Everyone was eager to hear what this controversial figure had to say. At the event, she declared that she was not afraid of the court and had done nothing illegal. She even promised to contact the UN if necessary. Her emotional speech once again moved the audience, and many sided with her. After this scandal, Flordelis not only did not lose influence but even became more popular. She received official permission to mentor some of the young people. Businessmen helped her buy a huge house for more than 50 people. A former garage was converted into a prayer room. The home services quickly developed into a lucrative business. She and her husband introduced the church tithe, 10% of the parishioners' income. Sponsors and benefactors flocked to her like a cornucopia. Soon she built the first fully fledged church on the site of an old tram depot. Now 5,000 people gathered daily for her sermons. But her greatest asset was her singing. Without hesitation, Flordelis launched a music career. In 1998, she released her debut album. She recorded a total of 8 studio albums and 1 live album. In 2002, Brazil's largest television channel awarded her the title of Mother of the Nation for her help for disadvantaged children. They then made a documentary with prominent actors. The film was shown at an international festival, and her image definitively became a cult classic. However, she had no luck in politics at first. In the next 2 years, she failed twice in elections, for city council and for mayor. It wasn't until 2018 that she made it into the Chamber of Deputies of Rio de Janeiro and received parliamentary immunity. Together with Anderson, she opened 8 branches of her church and launched a chain of stores featuring her portraits and motivational quotes. Income rose rapidly. Soon the couple moved to an elite neighborhood in Rio. They bought a fancy villa, a luxury car, and hired maids and security personnel. Although Anderson was 16 years younger, their marriage seemed perfect. Over time, he became her manager and accountant and then began preaching himself. But the more power Anderson gained, the less power Flordelis had. It got to the point where she couldn't spend a cent without her husband's consent. Anderson controlled all the finances, and this infuriated her. The couple grew distant, but for a public figure like Flordelis, divorce would have ruined her reputation. On June 16, 2019, Flordelis organized a romantic dinner in the hope of saving their relationship. They spent several hours at the restaurant and strolled along the waterfront until morning. According to her, they were followed by 2 men on motorcycles on their way home. Anderson tried to escape, but couldn't. At home, Flordelis went into the house while Anderson parked the car in the garage. Shots rang out. Flordelis rushed outside, but one of her adopted sons stopped her, saying, "You'd better not see that." Anderson was shot at point-blank range. About 30 bullets. Death was instantaneous. The assassination of the Mother of the Nation's husband shocked the entire country. Newspaper front pages gave it nationwide coverage. Many concluded that Flordelis herself was the target because of her political activities. She organized a mass prayer service in her husband's memory. Thousands of people came to support her. Police examined the camera footage and found strange details. No motorcycles were visible on the traffic cameras. The cameras on the house didn't film the garage. Too convenient, right? One camera, however, recorded something suspicious. 20 minutes before the murder, a taxi pulled up to the house. From there, Lucas, the adopted son and a former small-time dealer of illegal substances, emerged. He ran into the house and disappeared in another car. During interrogation, Lucas broke down and confessed that he had brought money into the house, apparently from his shady dealings. He explained that a week earlier he had bought a pistol at the request of another son, Flavio. Flavio disappeared after the murder but was quickly found. Things got even worse. It turned out that the children in the house lived according to a strict hierarchy. The younger ones obeyed the older ones, and all of them obeyed Flordelis. Their main task was to protect their mother at all costs. In fact, they were a personal protection force, ready for anything. The investigation revealed that the plan to eliminate Anderson had been maturing for almost a year. 6 attempts to poison him failed. Then Flordelis personally gave the order to change tactics. During interrogation, she, of course, denied everything and blamed her sons. She claimed that Anderson had cheated on her and that they had found correspondence on his phone and taken the law into their own hands, but the sons' statements were clear and consistent. She was guilty. Other dark details also came to light. Flordelis had intimate relationships with several adult adopted sons. Anderson obstructed their freedom. 6 sons were arrested for incitement to murder, but Flordelis herself could not be arrested at first because deputies were granted immunity. The public was outraged. Followers turned
2021 wurde ihr die
away.
Immunität
The church
entzogen.
empire
Im November
collapsed.
2022
her
verurteilte
immunity
das
was
Gericht
revoked.
Flordelis
In
zu
November
50 Jahren Haft,
2022, the
was
court
faktisch
sentenced
einer lebenslangen
Flordelis to
Freiheitsstrafe
50 years
entspricht.
in prison,
Der Mörder für
effectively
60
a
Jahre.
life sentence.
Lukas, der die
The
Waffe
murderer,
besorgt hatte, 7
Flavio,
Jahre.
received
So
33
endete die
years.
Geschichte einer Frau, die
Lucas,
sich aus
who
der
had
Armut
procured
heraus
the
bis an
weapon,
die Spitze der
received
Macht
7
hochgearbeitet
years.
hatte
Thus
und
ended the
schließlich an
story
ihrer
of a
eigenen
woman who had
Habsucht und
worked her way
Grausamkeit
from poverty
scheiterte.
to the pinnacle of power, ultimately failing because of her own greed and cruelty. Thanks for watching, and take care.